Ladies and gentlemen, the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Nikki Haley, accompanied by Chairman Emeritus of the Council of the Americas, Ambassador John Negroponte.
What a delight to be with you and to introduce our first speaker of the day. Thank you again to the Council of the Americas for being the premier forum for engaging on the most important issues of the Western Hemisphere. I'm John Negroponte, and I'm Chairman Emeritus of the Council of the Americas. I had the privilege and honor of holding many positions throughout my career in government, perhaps none greater than United States Ambassador to the United Nations. It's a special job, I can attest. It's at the center of United States diplomacy, and it's a leading voice for promoting United States values and policies to the world. The theme of our conference today is investing in the Americas, the new agenda for growth. By investing for growth, we refer to many dimensions: investing in relationships, investing in people, investing in shared values, and of course, investing in business and industry, which is why we're honored to be joined by our keynote speaker, Ambassador Nikki Haley, who will speak to us about United States foreign policy towards the Hemisphere and the administration's plans to invest in our prosperity, growth, and democracy in the Americas. Ambassador Haley is the 29th United States permanent representative to the United Nations. Since becoming ambassador in January 2017, she has been a particular champion for human rights. She's been a leading voice for the administration on this issue, actively promoting democratic values around the globe, from Venezuela to Syria to North Korea. Prior to her ambassadorship, she was governor of the great state of South Carolina from 2010 until her appointment to the United Nations in 2016. She was South Carolina's first ever female and minority governor. Her story of growing up as the daughter of Indian immigrants to become her state's first female governor and now UN ambassador represents the type of success and dynamism that we wish for all aspiring leaders in the hemisphere. With her, I know that my old job is in terrific hands. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, the Honorable Nikki Haley.
Really an honor. Thank you so much. That's so fun. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It really is great to be with all of you today. I first want to thank Susan Segal and Eric Farnsworth with the Council of Americas. And of course, I want to thank my esteemed predecessor, Ambassador John Negroponte. I'm here today because the Trump administration places a high priority on the Western Hemisphere, its security, its prosperity, and its freedom. And we recognize that the United States must reassert our leadership in the hemisphere. I have seen time and time again at the United Nations that when the United States fails to lead, we suffer, and the world suffers. This is even more true in our relationships with other nations. There is no substitute for strong U.S. leadership based on our values of political and economic freedom and respect for human rights. I will start this afternoon by stating something that should be clear to everyone here today. The prosperity of the United States is critically tied to the prosperity of the hemisphere. Our future is bound up with our neighbors. Among other things, we are each other's largest and best trading partners. The United States sells more goods and services to our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere than we do to China, Japan, and India combined. While a lot of attention is placed on issues of trade with China, we should keep in mind that we trade nearly 3 times as much with the Western Hemisphere as we do with China. We are also dependent on each other for security. Stopping drugs, gangs, and terrorists from crossing our borders begins with deterring threats before they reach the border. And the principle that ties it all together is something else the United States has in common with most of our neighbors in the hemisphere: a commitment to freedom. When he spoke to the Summit of the Americas in Peru last month, and again at the Organization of American States yesterday, Vice President Pence called the Western Hemisphere the Hemisphere of Freedom. That's a great description of the Americas. The Western Hemisphere is increasingly dominated by countries that share our political and economic principles. The great human rights activist Natan Sharansky had a test for evaluating the freedom of societies that he called the town square test. According to Sharansky, if someone can walk into a town square and express his or her views without being arrested, thrown in prison, or beaten, then they lived in a free society. If not, they lived in what he called a fear society. As we look across the Americas, it's pretty easy to tell the free societies from the fear societies. It's a testament to the people of Latin America and the love of freedom and dignity that exists in the human heart, that most of the hemisphere is free. As we know, it has not always been that way. Several major countries in Latin America will hold free and open elections this year. This is a good and precious thing, a real reason for us to celebrate in the United States. Not because we will always agree with these governments, but because democracies respect the rule of law and the rights of their people. And these are the preconditions for economic growth and hemispheric security. Poverty, corruption, and violence continue to be challenges that all countries face. The difference is how or if a government addresses those issues. Across Latin America, the good news is that these challenges are increasingly dealt with through a commitment to the rule of law and democratic institutions. The region is far from perfection, but the progress is unmistakable. There is one other country having what it calls an election in just a couple of weeks. But unlike the other elections I mentioned, the quote-unquote voting in Venezuela on May 20th is being done only to provide a phony cover for a dictator, not to determine the country's legitimate leadership. Venezuela's economy and civil society has seen a cataclysmic decline under Chavez and Maduro. We have all seen the tragic suffering of the Venezuelan people. In a region where 31% of the people are poor, a stunning 87% of Venezuelans live below the poverty line. A full 90% say they don't know where their next meal is coming from. Venezuelans live in conditions today that they haven't experienced in over 100 years. Children are dying of malnutrition. Hospitals are without medicine and supplies. Once eradicated diseases are now reappearing. And the currency is next to worthless, with the inflation rates of up to an unbelievable 18,000%. The Venezuelan people no longer have a government. They are the unwilling victims of a criminal narco state. And it was only a matter of time before the Venezuelan crisis became a regional crisis. Now, the instability that began with the Chavez regime denying the economic and human rights of its people has spilled over Venezuelans' borders. Today, the Maduro regime threatens the peace and security of the entire region. What has been described as the largest displacement of people in the region's history is now taking place in Latin America. Since 2014, the United Nations estimates that 1.5 million people have fled the poverty and violence in Venezuela. These desperate people are being received by neighboring countries. but they are straining city and state resources in Colombia, Brazil, Peru, and elsewhere. This is a crisis that demands the attention of the entire world. The last few years of European history have shown the potential for uncontrolled migratory flows to create political instability. Even relatively wealthy countries have experienced political and social backlash from trying to absorb large numbers of migrants. And Venezuelans' neighbors are not wealthy. Colombia has taken in more than 600,000 Venezuelan migrants. Thousands more arrive each day, further straining a country that is struggling to implement its own peace agreement. The Venezuelan crisis has created an immediate need for food, shelter, and medical assistance. The United States is helping. More countries must do so as well. But Venezuelan migrants, like those from Syria and other countries, want more than anything else to be able to go home. And that makes the real core regional problem not a lack of resources, but the continued rule of the Maduro regime. As long as Maduro keeps the stores empty, the streets dangerous, and the government unaccountable, Venezuelans will not return home, and instability in the region will grow. The implosion of Venezuela has also exposed another serious concern in Latin America: the government of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. For a long time, the Ortega government has looked less like a democracy and more like a dictatorship. The Maduro regime propped up Ortega with subsidized oil and other aid. Venezuela's self-destruction has ended that lifeline, and in the process, it has exposed the rot at the core of the Nicaraguan government. Like his patron in Caracas and his mentors in Havana, the Ortega government has stayed in power by rigging elections, intimidating critics, and censoring the media. In just the last month, the Nicaraguan people have found their voice after many years of corruption and misrule. It is the most serious threat to the Ortega government in a decade. It began when students and others took to the streets to first protest the poor response to massive fires. It grew larger as protests against changes to the Social Security system. But it has become much more than that, protesting the very legitimacy of the oppressive government itself. Police and pro-government mobs responded with lethal force. The government shut down independent radio and television stations. Over 60 people were killed or are still missing, and hundreds were injured. The images of the violence are horrific. One journalist was killed, shot in the head, while broadcasting live on Facebook. Another group of journalists described masked men breaking down the doors of their radio station and dousing the studio with gasoline. The thugs then fired into the gas and ignited the whole building. Hundreds of thousands have demonstrated in response, demanding democratic reforms and calling for Ortega's resignation. For the first time in many people's lives, Nicaraguans are unafraid to openly express their desire for a real choice in determining their future, despite the very real threat of violence. The United States calls on the Ortega government to make good on its offer to engage in a national dialogue. All sectors of Nicaraguan civil society, the business community, the students, and the Catholic Church, to name a few, must be included. But talking is not enough. The real test will be whether the Ortega government will meet the people's demands for democratic reforms and transparency. As Natan Sharansky might say, Nicaragua is a fear society that yearns to be a free society. The United States stands unequivocally with the people of Nicaragua in their demands for the same freedoms enjoyed by most of the rest of our hemisphere. The people of Venezuela also hunger for the right to control their own destiny. But the time for talking, the time for urging the Maduro regime to open up the voices of the people is long past in Venezuela. The so-called elections that are scheduled to occur in 12 days are a sham. Maduro will not change, and to prove it, he's holding rigged elections to give his reign of terror the veneer of democracy. But he's not fooling anyone. We cannot allow Maduro to portray his quote-unquote victory on May 20th as a validation of his rule. It will be nothing of the sort. As long as Maduro stops a credible independent observer mission, we know the results will be fraudulent. The systematic oppression of the Venezuelan people has become an active threat to the entire region. For the safety and the security of all peoples in Latin America, it is time for Maduro to go. When I traveled to Guatemala and Honduras earlier this year, I made a point of meeting with ordinary citizens, particularly women and girls. I do this in most countries I travel to. I find that it's one of the best ways to get the measure of a country. The people I met were proud and hopeful, and no less deserving than you or me for the right to freedom and dignity. Guatemala and Honduras face real challenges, but they're on the right track. This is what's at stake in the Americas today. At one point in time, there was a contest of ideas about forms of government in the Western Hemisphere. Today, that contest is over. The Cuban, Venezuelan, Nicaraguan model of socialism, dictatorship, corruption, and gross human rights violations has proved to be a complete and total failure. It has caused the suffering of millions of people. The freedom model of democracy, economic growth, and human rights is improving the lives of millions throughout the region. There is much work left to do, but so much progress has been made. So many people have sacrificed so much. We cannot allow the last few surviving authoritarians to drag down the hemisphere. As neighbors, the United States and all the nations of Latin America are bound together in this journey. If we stay true to our principles, I have no doubt we will succeed, and we will help ensure that the Western Hemisphere remains the hemisphere of freedom. Thank you.
Drop dead time. Are you willing to take?
We can take some questions.
Okay,
yeah.
good. First of all, let me thank you again for coming to this annual meeting of the Council of the Americas. And as you probably know, the Council was founded in 1965 by David Rockefeller and has really played a strong role in promoting hemispheric relations ever since that time. So your presence here today is a real encouragement to all of us. And the other thing I would like to mention in that connection is that we have multiple platforms, including 30 different meetings around the hemisphere during the course of the year. A very proactive New York office, which is only about 20 blocks away from the UN headquarters, including a very strong program to greet hemispheric leaders when they come to the city every fall for the general debate, with which you're extremely familiar. And so I know that we would welcome a continued relationship with you and your office as we go forward in all of this. You made a rather strong quote here that caught my attention. It is time for Maduro to go. And you explained what the difficulties in the situation are in Venezuela. And of course, they've been going on for a little while. It's not as if they started just yesterday. It's been sort of a gradual decline over the past half dozen years or so. And it's an incredible irony that the country with the largest oil reserves in the world finds itself in this terrible situation. So I guess to put it, and before I ask my question, let me mention that the Secretary General of the Organization of American States is here with us, Luis Almagro, and has been a very powerful voice in addressing the situation in Venezuela. It's time for Maduro to go. So how do we make that happen?
I'm not sure how we make that happen, but I know we can't stop. And the reason why I say that is you're looking at what was a very successful, wealthy country now fall to its knees over the ego of one person. And trying to get Maduro to go, I am convinced, depends on the region. Now, the region has tried to put pressure on Maduro. We saw that. We saw with the OAS that they tried to really make a difference, and then that didn't work. Now we see the Lima Group is coming together with like-minded countries to try and put pressure there as well, and we hope that that will work. I can tell you at the United Nations, when we started seeing the protests of thousands of people that were protesting the Maduro regime, it was an overwhelming, great event of people finding the power of their voice. But that quickly declined because it turned to violence. And at that point, because we always know conflict will come when you have a government that doesn't respect its people. And so as soon as we saw the violence start to come out, we immediately tried at the United Nations to have a Security Council meeting to talk about the fact that this was something that needed international attention. The members of the Security Council were quick to tell me that Security Council is only about peace and security, that this was an issue of human rights and needed to be taken up in Geneva. Well, so we went to Geneva. We went to Geneva to go and talk about Venezuela and human rights, and they would not let us have a hearing there because Venezuela sits on the Human Rights Council. So we didn't give up. We had a side event in Geneva to let them know that this is something we're going to continue to be loud about. We cannot be quiet about this. And I think what we saw was, you know, while we've had that meeting, we've since had a meeting in New York to continue to try, a side event in New York to continue to try and bring attention. But I'm convinced the brothers and sisters of the region, while they like to keep their problems in the family, they have to acknowledge when you've got one that's gone astray. And Maduro literally is affecting the entire region. So I think the biggest thing is we have to have loud voices. I think countries need to step up with aid to Venezuela. And I think we have to continue to isolate Maduro until he gives in.
So I'd be the first to agree with you that the problem is political, and it has to do with the leadership of that country. And that's wherein lies the ultimate solution to the problem that's faced. I would agree that the hands of the UN Security Council are probably pretty much tied, perhaps not so much because it's a human rights issue, but because of Russia and China. The Security Council can undertake just about any issue it wishes to, provided it can get a resolution passed. Right. But I'm afraid that you probably would only get the most feeble of resolutions out of the Security Council under these conditions. I think somewhat more encouraging is the situation in the Organization of American States, where some opinions have turned around. Brazil and Mexico and others have a little different view. They don't have the classic non-interventionist view that they had maybe a number of years ago, and are coming around to the urgency of the situation in that country. Be that as it may, there are and will continue to be humanitarian issues. Yes. The UN has a pretty big role in humanitarian matters, whether it's OCHA or the High Commission for Refugees or UNICEF and so forth. So I was just wondering, do you have some dealings with those agencies and those organizations in regard to the humanitarian
We do,
situation?
and I think that the United States and the United Nations are going to continue to do humanitarian efforts if Maduro will let the efforts happen. And that's really at at the heart of it. Is it's not just easy to send a lot of food and water and medical supplies. Maduro's really holding his hand over this and deciding who's the opposition, who gets aid, who doesn't get aid. It's a real problem, and I think that what's happening is you're seeing this mass exodus out of Venezuela, and now other countries in the region are having to deal with it. And so I think that there's a real desperation going on in the region that needs to be addressed.
We were very pleased, this is changing the subject here, that you were able to prioritize travel recently to Central America, including visits to Guatemala and Honduras. One of my former lives, I also happen to have been ambassador to Honduras during the late 1980s or the mid-1980s, and have great regard for the people and issues there, including the growing concern about security and the rule of law across the Northern Triangle. So I'm just wondering what your impressions were of that trip, what your takeaways were, and the way forward.
Well, and I know you have 5 souvenirs from Honduras,
That's
which
correct.
is a testament to the people of Honduras. I will tell you that, you know, the countries are beautiful. The people are amazing. Yes, they are facing challenges, but I think that there are real opportunities there. And the U.S. is very involved in both of those countries. In Honduras, we've got this, we're working with the Colombians in terms of training to really go after the drug crime, the gangs, and teach, and they're very much willing to accept that training. And I think that was the biggest part, is whether it was there or Guatemala, they're very receptive to help. What's happening in Guatemala is pretty amazing. To see the fact that U.S. forces working with Guatemalans in a way that they have been able to detect and interdict the drug shipping that's happening. They have seen a decrease this past year of 78%. That's massive. And so if they can continue to build on that, continue to share with the Hondurans and work towards that, I think we're really getting to the heart of how we stop crime in those areas. They also still have corruption, but I think that's a work in progress. But I saw a lot of ways we can work together with both those countries. I think the United States is committed that if we can stop crime in those countries, and that stops it before it gets to our country, and we saw 2 governments that were very willing to partner.
I'm just going to give the members a heads up here that the ambassador has agreed to take a couple of questions from. You're telling me no, Eric? Is it against the rules?
Why don't you tell me? I'll ask you a question. How has looking at the Americas? You didn't know this was going to happen.
I didn't know that we didn't run this organization.
Looking at the Americas, how has it changed from when you were in the United Nations to where it is now?
Well, the time I was there, we were preoccupied with the Iraq situation, almost to the exclusion of just about any other issue. So I spent an awful lot of my life, first of all, getting a resolution passed on an inspection regime for Iraq, which was successful, Resolution 1441. As you've learned already, the UN and football have something in common, which is the plays have numbers, right? And so do the resolutions, yes. And everybody talks in this kind of a code. So 1441 had to do with establishing a pretty strong inspection regime. But then we just didn't really give it enough time, this is my own view, to really delve into its work. And we lost our patience and then took a military action anyway. So the second part of my job was, as we were building up to that attack, to try and get the UN to approve the military action, to approve the use of all necessary means to remove the Saddam regime. And that didn't work out, so we ended up, because President Chirac said he was going to veto any such resolution, so we ended up going in with a coalition of the willing. One of the most interesting parts about it was that afterwards, once we'd gone in, and to many people's disapproval, they all wanted to play a role in helping run the country of Iraq afterwards, and since we were occupying it, they very much wanted to help us by working with us again to pass these various resolutions. And if you look at it, there's a whole slew of them that sort of basically say how we're going to administer Iraq during the occupation. So anyway, that was probably the single most prominent activity in which we were engaged. Of course, and that is a segue to a question I really did want to ask you. Middle East. The Middle East continues to be a preoccupation in a variety of different ways, and I suppose the most salient of which is the situation in Syria. And although it's not, we're way out of region here, I'm sure members would be interested in hearing a bit about how you view the situation in Syria and what you think the prospects for international action are on that one.
You know, there's such a lesson to learn from Syria, because I want to go back. I think with all of these conflicts, we never look enough at what started the conflict. You know, we talked about that with Nicaragua today in terms of what started their protests. Well, in Syria, you have to think back. What happened? You had a group of teenage kids just having a good time that decided to spray paint a few things on a wall. It wasn't even that bad. And you had the regime have their officers go out, pick up those kids, beat them, pull their nails out, brutalize them, and then take them back home to their parents. Their parents did exactly what every one of us would have done. They got upset, they went out to the streets, and they protested. This is what happens when you don't deal with a situation on the front end, because you can end up with a Syria 8 years later on the back end that's in total destruction. This was a beautiful country that now is in shambles because it all started with a government that wouldn't listen to its people. And now you look at Syria, it's really a mess. You've got more hands in that pot than we ever should have had. I think from the United States standpoint, obviously, bringing peace to the region is a priority, but you've got a regime that has used chemical weapons like it's candy. You have Russia, who has literally covered them and allowed them to do it so that no international pressure can be put on them. And you've got Iran waiting in the wings to take advantage of all of it. And so, you know, the goal with Syria is that's my Iraq. You know, we're spending more time on Syria than we ever should. But the sad part is we've had 12 resolutions against the Syrian regime, all vetoed by Russia. We've had 6 resolutions against chemical weapons in Syria, all vetoed by Russia. And so we're sitting in a situation, but I think it goes back to what we're talking about in Venezuela, what we're talking about in Nicaragua, is you really do have to look at the human rights of people in their countries. And if a government doesn't respect the human rights, people are going to find the power of their voice. And when they find the power of their voice, how the government responds dictates what happens in that country and in that region later. And so Syria is an amazing example of what happens when the international community doesn't act at a time that you see crisis break out.
So you asked me how I felt things might have changed. Of course, I don't have the close-up experience that you now have, but one thing I'm almost certain has not changed is that I spent an awful lot of time covering for Israel in the United Nations, particularly in the Security Council. Yes, we had to beat back some resolutions, but once you use the veto once, then people don't come back for a while, but they'll test you every now and then about whether you're prepared to veto a particular resolution. But where we really spent quite a bit of energy was during the General Assembly and the general debate, because practically every resolution on any which subject usually had appended to it some kind of criticism of the country of Israel. And so we had to try to get those things either toned down, or sometimes we would vote against such resolutions, and it was kind of hopeless to get too many others to join us in doing that, but our strategy was to try to get as many abstentions as possible, right, on the theory that if you could get more abstentions than votes in favor, that was sort of a victory of sorts. So I'm sure you face some of those kinds of questions, and especially now with the move of our embassy to Jerusalem and so forth.
Well, you know, I think that, look, from the very, I think, first week I got to the United Nations, the issue of Israel and the Palestinians was right there. But it wasn't because there was an act. It's because it was habit in the UN. There were constant times and ways through resolutions that they would just bully Israel, that they would downgrade Israel, that they would do these things. And I literally had heard about it but was shocked. It was abusive how bad the international community was to Israel. It reminded me of a kid being bullied in the playground. And when you see somebody bullying the kid in the playground, the other kids come up and bully too because it makes them feel big. And I just wasn't going to have it. It was just so upsetting to see that I just started yelling at everybody and told them that they had to stop, that we weren't going to put up with this anymore, that we had the back of Israel, and if they were going to mess with Israel, they had to mess with the U.S. And I think we've been able to tamp it down, but it really is a culture in the United Nations of constantly bashing Israel. And when the move of the embassy came, I mean, keep in mind, this was the will of the American people. The American people, through their congressional members, had advocated for the embassy to be moved to Jerusalem for years. And for decades, presidents had been told, you can't do it, you know, the sky will fall. Well, the President Trump did it, and the sky's still up there. And what we saw is it needed to happen. We needed to move that ball. And now that we've moved that ball, what we're trying to encourage is to have President Abbas come to the table to reconcile, to have the Palestinians and Israelis really look to find a solution in the best interest of all the people in the region. And it's important for us for security. So it's a priority for the United States to try and do that. And yes, when they tried to humiliate us at the UN for moving the embassy, we stood tall, we stood proud, we took it. And now since, I think we've seen that Honduras is now moving their embassy, Paraguay is now moving their embassy, and I think you'll continue to see the rest of them roll.
Well, you've been very generous with your time.
Thank you so much.
Madam Ambassador, you have been and continue to be a very effective spokesperson for the United States at the United Nations and to the American public as well. I think people have, all around our country have very much enjoyed and been interested in listening to you speak whenever you do speak on a national scale. So congratulations for the job you're doing, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, and we will continue to be in touch with the Council of the Americas, but you call me and give me advice anytime. I will take it. Thank you all very much. Thank you so much. That was fun. Thank you.